What's up, ladies and gentlemen? Welcome back to Hands Off My Hobo Rocket. And today we're going to be talking about how to properly rebuild an NHL team. Because a few teams are currently, in the phases of it. Arizona, some teams are at the end of this phase of rebuilding, Edmonton. And some teams are gearing up for that big rebuild. Like, Dallas, Carolina. And then there's some teams that don't even have to think about rebuilding. Pittsburgh and probably Nashville, Ottawa, Las Vegas. The teams like that that are kind of at the extremely competitive level. And, the NHL is, you can, just looking at the standings, you can tell it's pretty polarized. There are teams that are playing at an elite level that aren't even thinking about the draft. They don't really care about their first round draft pick, let alone their second or third. They just want to get rid of them and get depth players to make a deep playoff run. But then there are other teams that really, really, really want those draft picks, because those draft picks are going to allow them to rebuild for the future and allow them to have a chance later on, probably 5-10 years, to make a deep playoff push. The Arizona Coyotes are a perfect example for that. With them, bringing up guys like Clayton Keller, Max Domi, but then they traded a few of their young prospects for defensemen because they don't have them, but also drafting Oliver Ekman-Larsson. Getting these young elite players, that's something that's extremely important when rebuilding an NHL franchise. So here's kind of my opinion and what I think is a pretty good strategy from a GM and from a coach standpoint. So first things first, before you even think about who you're going to draft, you got to think about who's going to coach your kids, because that's ultimately going to decide how you draft and how you play. Your play style is extremely important, because if some players can't fit into that system, they're just not going to play that well. So the first thing you want to do is find that good coach for a GM. And then that coach and that GM, that organization, are going to sit down and think about how they're going to draft. Now, you kind of have three starting options of who you want to draft. You either want to draft your first line center, it could be left or right wing, but your first line offense, or one of your guys on your top two defensive pairings, or your starting goalie. So an example I'm going to use a few, the Los Angeles Kings and the Pittsburgh Penguins, because they've drafted extremely well. And for the Kings, the way they drafted, first they drafted in the first round of 2003, Dustin Brown. Drew Doughty, 2008, first round, second overall. They signed Jack Johnson. Alec Martinez was a fourth round pick. Jonathan Quick was a third round pick. And Anze Kopitar was a first round pick. So you can see that the Kings are starting off by building that first line and second line and that defensive pairing to gear up for a playoff run. They wanted to get that offense down first. Drew Doughty was drafted a year before they won the Stanley Cup. So they weren't really thinking about, we need to draft defense first. And if you look at the 2008-2009 Penguins, they drafted Sidney Crosby in 2005. But before that, they drafted Marc-Andre Fleury in 2003. And they also had drafted, I believe, Evgeny Malkin in 2004. So they first decided to look at their goaltending, because Pittsburgh has had a long history of either extremely good goaltenders like Tom Barrasso or extremely bad goaltenders. And the Penguins decided to invest in a goalie first. And then they decided to invest in their centers, because for the next 3 years, the 3 to 4 years, their first overall pick was a center. First it was Malkin, then it was Crosby, and then in 2006 it was Stahl. And even before Fleury was drafted, they actually drafted with their fifth overall pick in 2002, they drafted Ryan Whitney. So you can see the Penguins started with their defense, goalies, and then went just straight to center depth. And that's something that I'm going to move into now. Once you draft one of your top three things, the center or offense, then top two defense and goalie, then you can start thinking about your second line, your third line, your depth players, and your depth wingers. Now you need to have there are different kinds of depth wingers. For example, in the 2016 Penguins Stanley Cup run, Phil Kessel played on the third line as a sniper. Now, it's very rare that you'll hear a player like Phil Kessel playing on a third line. That's just because the Penguins had depth. On the wings they had, Connor Sheary, Brian Rust, Patrick Hornquist, Carl Hagelin, guys like this, speed guys. And Phil Kessel fit right into that, but he had a different mold than when Malkin had played. When Malkin was center, he didn't work with that. He worked with Nick Bonino. So the Penguins had enough depth to be able to put a sniper, not a two-way forward or a power forward, on the third line wing. So the Penguins worked on gathering that quote-unquote depth. You see a lot of teams talking about, oh yeah, they like depth as in the center, or they like defensive depth. That's just because they don't have a third or fourth line center or a top six defenseman they can put in their third defensive pair or even their second defensive pair. That's extremely important for a team. So if we look up at the makeup of the Kings' run in 2011-12 to win the Stanley Cup, their first before they won in 2014, and this was against the New Jersey Devils when they won, not the Rangers, where Henrik Lundqvist was left stunned in overtime. If we just look at their makeup, they had players. Let's just look at their scoring. They had Anze Kopitar, Justin Williams, Dustin Brown, Mike Richards, Drew Doughty, Jack Johnson, Willie Mitchell, Jared Stoll, Slava Voinov, Simon Gagne, Matt Green, Alec Martinez, Kyle Clifford, Jeff Carter, Rob Scuderi. They had a lot of good depth players. And goalie-wise, they had an amazing goalie tandem. They had Jonathan Quick and Jonathan Bernier. Now, Quick started 68 games, won 35, lost 21. Bernier, who's extremely young, he was 23. He started 13. He won 5, lost 6. But Bernier's save percentage was actually almost it was low starter. It was 909, but his goals against average was exactly where you want a medium starter to be, which Bernier is right now. It was at 236. And Jonathan Quick was playing arguably the best year in his career. He had a save percentage of 292 and goals against average of 195. That's absolutely insane. He had 10 shutouts also. So, they had the Kings had necessary depth. Down the middle, they had Kopitar, they had Richards, they had Carter, and they had Trevor Lewis. Now, you have a young Mike Richards and a middle-aged Jeff Carter. You have depth down the middle because those two are experienced players. Well, now they're experienced players. Back then, they played like veterans. Jeff Carter was well esteemed back then, and he's seen as still an elite third line forward or second line center. But back then, it was the same thing there. He was that good, and it was the Kings had a necessary depth. And on the wings, they had guys like Dustin Brown, they had Justin Williams, Dustin Penner. That was an interesting pickup by them. Dwight King, a very young Dwight King at 22, who was very, very important in their 2014 run. And then you guys got Brad Richardson, Kyle Clifford, and Simon Gagne, who's really old. And that was important to have that depth down the sides as well. And then defensively, they had Drew Doughty, and then they had Matt Green, Alec Martinez, Willie Mitchell, Slava Voinov, and Rob Scuderi. Having Rob Scuderi on your defense is extremely important because when he won with the Penguins in 2009, he was seen as a living legend for what he did in the finals. And having someone who had been through the playoffs before, who knew the intensity, who was a veteran, really helped because Drew Doughty was 22 years old. You Matt Green 28, Alec Martinez 24, Willie Mitchell 34. He was another. Willie Mitchell was a very good pickup by them. He was another just well, he knew how to play the game because even though he was an 8th-round pick by New Jersey in 1996, he knew he had experience in the playoffs. With the Devils, in the early 2000s. So, he had a lot of experience in the playoffs, so he was able to help. He was the Norris Trophy winner that year, the 2011-2012. He won the Norris Trophy at the age of 34. He was crucial. He was part of the backbone for that Kings team. If we look at that 2008-2009 Penguins team, we look at defense, and you get Ryan Whitney, who at a very young age of 23 won the Norris. Then you had, Sergei Gonchar. Sergei Gonchar won. He didn't win. He never won a Norris Trophy, but he was an elite defenseman for the Penguins. He was absolutely amazing, even though that 2 years from then he was let go and he had to go to Ottawa. He contributed heavily on the power play with the big slap shot he had that led to a lot of one-time goals or deflection goals for Crosby or Malkin. And defensively, he was extremely good. You can see here that ice time during the Stanley Cup runs, in the playoff runs, he averaged, for Pittsburgh, 26 minutes, 25 minutes, 23 minutes, 26 minutes. He averaged a lot of time on the ice. He was very, very instrumental. He was extremely helpful. Similarity-wise, he was very similar. He played very similar to, Zdeno Chara, Chris Chelios, Scott Niedermayer, Chris Pronger, Guy Boucher, my bad. And during his career overall, you could see he was a lot like Chris Chelios, the way he played. And Chris Chelios, if you're a hockey fan, know that he was just an amazing defenseman, right shooting defenseman. He played for a bunch of teams, played for Montreal, Chicago, Toronto for a year, back in Chicago, and he finished up his career with Detroit and Atlanta. And he played until he was almost 50. And so he won a Norris twice. But having a guy very similar to Chelios quarterbacking your defense and then your power play was extremely important for the Penguins because their power play was insane that year. And they made some really good late acquisitions of, Bill Guerin, former captain of the New York Islanders, really helped, a young Sidney Crosby grow, Chris Kunitz as well. And then you had a young Tyler Kennedy who was always full of energy with Matt Cook, Max Talbot. And then you had young Chris Letang. Now, Chris Letang was something else. That year, when he won the Stanley Cup with the Penguins this first time, even though he averaged only 19 minutes on the ice, he was instrumental in a few games, especially the game, I think it was Game 5 against Washington, where he had the overtime winner against the juggernaut Washington Capitals, where Alex Ovechkin was on a tear. So you can see that both the Kings and the Penguins, and this can be said the same with the Chicago Blackhawks and the Boston Bruins, and even if we go older, early 2000s, the New Jersey Devils, the Tampa Bay Lightning. Then this can be, you can see they first started with their first line offense, top two defense, and goalie. They first decided that's my core. Then they worked on a second line center and then a second defenseman and then a third line center and then a few wingers and then their fourth and fifth defenseman. And during those seasons, you made some good trades. With the Penguins, they were able to pick up Kunitz and Guerin, which were absolutely phenomenal pickups because Chris Kunitz won 3 Stanley Cups with the Penguins, and Bill Guerin is now the head of hockey operations for the minor league team, the Wilkes-Barre Scranton Baby Penguins, who are arguably one of the best minor league teams in hockey right now. And the Penguins I'd say they got pretty lucky with drafting because they sucked for a few years. They really sucked. Like from when Jaromir Jagr left in 2001, I believe, to 2007, they sucked. They were terrible. They had top 5 picks out the wazoo. They were able to get Stahl, Fleury, Malkin, Rittny, Crosby. And then Chris Letang was kind of a steal. He was a 3rd-round pick. And he turned out to be one of the top elite defensemen, even though he had a lot of injuries. And Marc-Andre Fleury, he's an absolute maniac with his glove hand. His flexibility and his reaction time is absolutely amazing. And even though now he's with the Vegas Golden Knights, he was a 1st overall pick. The Penguins traded up for him. I think the Penguins had the 3rd or 4th or 5th overall pick. They traded up to get Marc-Andre Fleury because they knew he was going to be that good. And obviously Sidney Crosby, best player alive. Honestly, he could be top 5 ever to play. But then if we look at the growth of that team, seeing that team grow, because then they won 2015, 2016, and 16-17. The growth of that team is insane because the Penguins started drafting defensemen later on because they were successful. Ian Cole, for example, he was drafted first round, 18th overall by the St. Louis Blues, and the Penguins traded for him. That was a great trade. Then they traded for Trevor Daley, who was a 2nd-round pick. Brian Dumoulin was a 2nd-round pick by Carolina. They traded for him. Phil Kessel. They traded for him. He was a 5th overall pick by Boston in 2006. It's very rare that you give up a 1st-round pick and a few prospects that don't turn out to do much for Phil Kessel and a few minor league players, and you come out on top. Toronto never came out on top with the trade with Boston, but the Penguins have. And this has been, the Penguins picked up Phil Kessel, and he started a line of his own, the HBK line. Olli Maatta was, the Penguins' 1st-round pick in 2012, and he's turned out to be, a very, very good top 4, maybe, top 4 best, top 6 easily defenseman for the Penguins. He can play, top 2, top 4, top 6. He's got, he's working on his speed. He's got a good hockey IQ. So the Penguins have drafted well there. Brian Rust, Mr. Playoffs for them. He was a 3rd-round pick by the Pens. That's just good scouting. That's just good depth drafting. And then Justin Schultz was a 2nd-round pick by Anaheim, who then went to Edmonton. And then the Pens traded for him. They traded practically nothing for Justin Schultz, and he became a reclamation project for Sergei Gonchar. And he ended up, head manning the Penguins' defense when Chris Letang was out with his neck problem in their back-to-back run. And that's absolutely insane that you pick up a guy who was deemed an outcast by the Edmonton Oilers, a historically good team that just needed as much defense as they could get, and he becomes a top 2 defenseman, top 4 easily, and leads the team to a Stanley Cup with no Chris Letang. And then the Penguins also, they actually, this is an undrafted amateur. He was an undrafted rookie, Connor Sherry. Sherry was an absolute great signing by the Penguins. He if you could redo his draft, he would go 3rd round easily. He was that good of a signing for them. And then the Penguins also, they signed Matt Cullen. And Matt Cullen has an extremely illustrious career. 2nd-round draft pick by Anaheim in '96. It was a great pickup for the Penguins, and he helped the back-to-back run. And then Matt Murray, he was a diamond in the rough because he's an elite goaltender, and he learned from Marc-Andre Fleury. Third-round pick. He was a third-round pick. Right now, I could see him going top 5. If you redid that 2012 draft, he would be top 5, just because of his calm, his poise, and how good he ended up becoming. Then Patrick Hornquist was Mr. Irrelevant when Crosby got drafted, and now he's on a line with Crosby. So the Penguins, they drafted well along with the Kings. Though the Kings are kind of having problems right now, but they have, Adrian Kempe. They're drafting well still. This depth drafting is extremely important because that helps you shore up your bottom 6 forwards. Those are extremely important during the playoffs because those are the guys that make the difference. You'll get elite players, like during, a Washington-Pittsburgh or an LA San Jose or a LA Chicago series, your top 6, sometimes top 3, but most times top 6 guys just for both teams just cancel each other out. Patrick Kane versus Dustin Brown, Jonathan Taves versus Andrei Kopitar, Crosby versus Ovechkin or Backstrom or Kuznetsov, Kessel versus Ovechkin still. It's insane. Ovechkin matches up against anyone. He's that good, and defensively he's that great. In Washington, however, we see Washington drafts so good. They have so many good players. They have Braden Holtby in net, but they can't get to they can't get past the second round. That's because they don't have that depth. Their bottom 6 really tails off, and most teams can just walk right over those bottom 6. So, they'll play tons of mismatches against that. And then if we look at the 2016-2017 Penguins, it was almost the exact same as their previous year, but they added a few guys. Jake Gensel, third-round pick, 2013, another diamond in the rough. Ron Hainsey, first round, 13th overall pick by Montreal. I believe they traded for him, I want to say. I'm going to check that real quick. He was traded to Pittsburgh by Carolina for Danny Cristo and the second-round pick. And he ended up being a Stanley Cup champion. Scored a few pivotal goals in the Stanley Cup, and really regained his self-esteem because before in Carolina he was just downtrodden, never making the playoffs, always playing terrible. But now, moving to Pittsburgh, he played absolutely amazing. And you have Carter Rowney, undrafted. He's a really good depth forward that you get. It helps because it helps having a depth guy like Rowney on the wing because he can also play center. He's good at back checking. He's good at forward checking. He plays the penalty kill well. He's fast. He has, he's not afraid to get down and dirty, play gritty a bit. And you also have guys, you need guys like Carter Rowney, like Matt Cullen, like Nick Bonino, to play your bottom 6, because that allows your top 6 guys to just work on offense, because your bottom 6 can take those defensive faceoffs, can take those defensive zone time at the end of the game when you're up by 1 and there's like 3 minutes left and you're stuck in your own zone and you keep having to dump and change. It allows your bottom 6 allows your top 6 to do their work, and your top 6 allows your bottom 6 to rest. That's just the dynamic the team has to have. And with the defense, it's almost the same thing. Your top 2 defense, they allow your top 6 forwards to do their scoring. They can help with the scoring, but then your top 2 defense also should be defensively skilled enough to help your bottom 6 forwards. Shot block, clear lanes, play in front of the net, and get rid of screens, have good defensive recovery, and then your top 4 add a bit more to that, but also add a bit more. That allows them to open the ice up a bit by having good skating, and then your bottom, your last defensive pairing really should be your defensive lockdown group. For the Penguins, that's Ian Cole and Brian Dumoulin. That those two guys are like the lockdown crew. Whenever you need two guys on the ice to make sure a goal isn't scored and to make sure the puck's always getting out, you put those two guys on the ice because they could be a bottom. They could be a bottom defensive pair. They could be a top defensive pair. It's just the situations they play. They're good like that. And then also the Penguins, they acquired Mark Streit. Mark Streit was a great pickup. He was traded for a 4th-round pick from Tampa to Pittsburgh. Insane that he was worth a 4th-round pick, even though he was a 9th-round pick in 2004. He was a great pickup for the Penguins. So, as I think I got a bit sidetracked, but you can tell that rebuilding an NHL team really depends on how you want to start. You start goalie, then you build offense, center depth, defense, and then you get your wings, you draft well, you continue to draft well, and have a good farm system. That's one thing that's extremely, extremely important, having a good farm system. Because if you don't have a good minor league team to, raise the kids, raise your young draft picks that are in your third, fourth, fifth round that don't automatically break the NHL roster, you're missing out. You're missing out on players that could really make differences. And the Penguins have that. The Kings have that. Washington, however, doesn't. And everyone thinks, this is going to be the year for Washington. This is going to be the year for Washington. And they just don't have that. New York, everyone thinks, they have Henrik Lundqvist in between the pipes. He can carry the team. But Henrik Lundqvist needs people in front of him to score. And the Rangers kept trying to get, they got Jimmy Vesey, who hasn't really turned out as well as he needed to be. And they went after those star players instead of, investing in the draft. The Penguins smartly did. Carolina has, Chicago has, a lot of teams that decided to invest in the draft have, started to turn out well. And with that's a bit on rebuilding in the NHL. But now I just want to talk a bit of what's happening around the sports world. A little overview since we're done talking rebuilding, and it looks like in the NBA, Kawhi Leonard once again out with a reoccurring quad injury. Now the Spurs have maintained to be a top 5 team in the league, probably top 3 in the West, or top 5 power ranking at least. Just because LaMarcus Aldridge has found his older self when he played in Portland. His offense has gotten so good defensively. He's so much stronger just because he's working under Popovich. But the Spurs still aren't healthy, and I think that's going to be one of the midseason questions they have. We're not healthy. Do we rest everyone still through the season and squeak by into the playoffs, maybe get a 4 or 5 seed, or do they rush everyone and try to get that 2-3 seed? That's going to be a question Popovich and R.C. Buford are going to have to ask themselves during the All-Star break, because they might have to either make a trade or two to either ensure depth, even though they have an insane amount of depth, ensure playoff depth with the injuries they have and how lingering they are. And then James Harden looks like he's gonna return for the Rockets. He should return. That should be a big impact on that team. Chris Paul is absolutely amazing, but they need James Harden. His shooting ability is absolutely amazing. And that's all in the NBA. And then, in the MLB, Josh Harrison says he wants out from the Pirates. I don't blame him. Makes sense. If the Pirates are truly tanking, they need to get rid of him to let, guys like Max Moroff, Christian Bostic, allow young guys to play. Christian Yelich says him and the Marlins are over. He wants to get on with his career and that means he wants to get away from the Marlins. So whoever needs a center fielder that's young, that's bright, please call the Miami Marlins. They're in fire sale mode. And I think, sadly, Yelich might end up going to the coast, going to the opposite side of the states, because that's where he probably fit best. Or he might be going to the Rangers. He might be going to Detroit. He might be going to a few places like that need a center fielder and still are, rebuilding. And then the Mets expect Michael Conforto to return in May after his return from shoulder surgery, which is good. They really need him. He's only 24, Conforto, and he can be a big key for their playoff runs. And in the NFL, unsurprisingly, Todd Haley is gone. He made some very bad calls during the Jacksonville game, so he's gone, just done. I believe the quarterback coach for the Steelers has been promoted to offensive coordinator, and people are saying, Tomlin should also leave. No, Tomlin's not going to leave. Tomlin has taken this team to 2 Super Bowls. He knows what he's doing, and I think it was his say that got Haley out of there. And speaking of Steelers offensive coordinators and offensive coaches, Mike Munchak, the legendary offensive line coach, declines the second Cardinals interview. So it looks like he wants to stay with the Steelers and win that Super Bowl. Which is big news because Mike Munchak has turned the Steelers offensive line into an elite group of warriors for Ben Roethlisberger, and has kept Ben Roethlisberger honestly playing football. If Ben's offensive line did not get better, he'd be retired by now, just because of how many hits and sacks he's taken. Like health-wise, he just would not be able to play. But with that concludes the show today. So I hope everyone is having a good day, staying positive. If you want to talk more sports, please hit me up on Twitter @_SVish. Let me know what you're thinking. Let me know if you guys want to hear any other sports with the Olympics coming up. I will definitely be talking those. But other than that, I hope you all have a good day. See you on the flip side.